I mean, when I say that we are eating the earth, what I'm saying is that agriculture is eating the earth. That agricultural sprawl that I was hinting about now covers 40% of the land on this planet. And the richer the farmer is, or the bigger the farmer is, the more money they get through this subsidy system. It is very hard going up against the agricultural Borg because around the world, there are $300 billion worth of agricultural subsidies every year. And most of it are just direct handouts with no strings attached. And so I come along and at the very least, I'm saying like, hey, can we at least attach some strings?
Welcome to Everybody Gets Pie, the podcast about making the American pie of opportunity big enough so that everybody can get their slice. This is a podcast focused on the need for more American abundance in housing and energy and childcare, innovation, and more. I'm Justine, and as always, I'm joined by co-hosts Armand and Burhan. Now, abundance is about more than just housing, I promise. Earlier, we spoke about the very important topic of food abundance with author Michael Grunwald. He wrote the book, We Are Eating the Earth, The Race to Fix Our Food System and Save Our Climate. Let's take a listen.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
So for our readers, I actually know Michael, or not readers, our listeners, I actually know Michael in real life because 20 years ago, I read his book, basically the Obama stimulus. And it was one of the things that actually made me, who was originally entered college as kind of a conservative, become convinced that actually government spending could be good, it could be efficient, it could do a lot of good. And so it's been quite a journey when I got to meet him recently when he did a book talk for his new book, We Are Eating the Earth. And so really excited to get into that today with Michael. But before we go into food, I'd actually want to ask him about this article that you wrote 19 years ago called DC's Fear of Heights. Could you tell us how this started your abundance journey, why you were abundance before it was cool?
Exactly. I'm OG. So this is when I was the Outlook essayist for the Washington Post, which, is sort of our Sunday kind of essay section. And I had this crazy idea to write about why the DC height limit sucks. Which at the time was an extremely unpopular position and was actually seen as somewhat wacky. We actually timed it to run over the July 4th weekend. So I remember the lead was sort of about how this is the day when everybody's going to have a nice view of the fireworks because of the DC height restriction. But it's still a really bad idea because essentially abundant housing is good and it increases the supply and decreases the price. And this is why we feel like rats in a maze. But I will say that the editor of the Washington Post at the time was a guy named Len Downey, who probably his biggest claim to fame is that he was quoted saying that he is so unopinionated that he didn't vote because he didn't even want to think about having opinions and who was better. He just wanted to report on the news. But that Monday, when I got to my desk, Len Downey was waiting there to yell at me about how crazy I was to don't you know that the height restriction is what makes DC DC? So this guy was so unopinionated, he didn't vote, but he did make an exception for this one opinion, which is that abundant housing was bad. So I appreciate what you guys are up against.
That's funny. I have to mention that. So I'm in Falls Church, Virginia, and part of the reason that Falls Church, Virginia has gotten built up so much is because DC is not building enough housing. We've grown our population by 40% over the past couple decades. So anyway, there's absolutely legitimacy to what you're saying.
It's the reason all that sprawl, all that traffic. I mean, that back then the book was Edge Cities, right? We don't call them that anymore. But Falls Church and Roslyn and Tyson's Corner, those basically owe their existence to the DC height limit.
Oh, absolutely. I wouldn't even be on city council maybe if Falls Church didn't exist, if DC didn't have its height limits. But what I will say, it's funny because Paris, I don't know, it's very much like a city of 7, 8 stories, but it's very dense. So it is possible to have a ton of density with, I don't know if they have a specific height limit, but there is sort of a accepted cap to how tall Paris goes in a lot of places. So it's possible to like have density and have a cap versus have everything be skyscrapers.
The thing about is like the old town is definitely, or the center, the historic part is definitely like that 6 to 8 stories density. But then they've gone the opposite, where their suburbs become towers very, very quickly. So it's almost like tower suburbs, and then you commute into like the what we think of it like as a historic part of Paris.
Okay, so it's basically the opposite of how you want a city to be structured, which is like high density in the middle and then lower density as you go out, rather than having low density in the center and then high density as you go out, like the DC Metro.
I'm the only person who's gone to Paris who's been like, I want to go to La Défense and check it out.
Well, I will just say, if we're going to foreshadow a little bit, the thing about whether the density is in the very middle or just a little outside the middle, if you have density in the urban area, then you don't sprawl as much into where the bugs and bunnies are. You're able to have more nature out where nature is. And it turns out, that's the story of urban sprawl. We'll get to agricultural sprawl, but it works on pretty much the exact same principle.
Do you take credit for like the change in opinion in housing? Like not maybe entire credit, but like, you were one of the early voices. Is that like as a journalist, are you proud? Like I was right early. I had this unpopular take and now it's mainstream. And so I deserve credit for it.
Oh yeah. Oh no, I'm totally braggy about the fact that I was onto it early, but I had absolutely zero influence. Nobody cared. Iglesias came along 15 years later and started saying the rent is too damn high. And this is why people are like, that guy's making a lot of sense. Nobody thought I was making any sense.
We should ask Matt at some point, like if he read your article and thought it was convincing,
He was like 12 at the time. So,
I mean, I feel this way about things that like I wrote in high school that I think are still true, but like it didn't change because like DC Heightland Act is still there.
Right.
It's like I don't feel credit for like getting it early. I feel super frustrated that it's like I'm still right, but the world isn't correcting itself.
Yeah, this has been a theme of my journalistic career. I feel I'm like that meme of the why are you booing me? I'm right. That's how I feel like most of the time.
Well, so let's get to your book because I think there's a lot of exactly that. Of like, why are you booing me? I'm right. The way I see your book, Eating the Earth, is that it's about basically food abundance, about how we need to change policy to make food healthier, cheaper, and environmentally cleaner at a mass scale. And it touches that in a lot of different ways, ranging from like, for example, using better technology to improve yields, but also how we use land and how it currently really harms the environment. Do you think that's the correct way to see it? And how do you view your thesis?
Absolutely. I do think, this hasn't been lumped in with sort of the abundance story as much, partly because I think some of the abundance leaders have been a little bit they're taking so much incoming fire already, like they don't want to wade into food, which is, another really tendentious issue that, people vote on 3 times a day. But absolutely, I'm telling a story about food abundance. I mean, when I say that we are eating the earth, what I'm saying is that agriculture is eating the earth. That agricultural sprawl that I was hinting about now covers 40% of the land on this planet, while urban and suburban and exurban sprawl, the developed area, is only 1%. So really, this natural planet is becoming an agricultural planet. We're losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest every 6 seconds. And it's because agriculture keeps sprawling all over the place to make more food. Now we need more food. We're going to need like 50% more calories by 2050 to feed a growing population. And as we're going to need about 70% more meat on our current trajectory, and meat uses even more land. So that's why we are currently on track to deforest another dozen Californias worth of land by 2050. And we just don't have another dozen Californias worth of forest to spare. So the story I'm telling is that we need to make more food, but with less land and making less of a mess, fewer emissions.
You have a really interesting statistic analogizing this to like how many Olive Garden breadsticks everybody have to consume. What was that?
Oh gosh, I'm gonna mangle it. But yeah, when I talk about how many more calories we're gonna need, it's basically like it comes out to several Olive Garden's breadsticks for everybody on Earth every day. That's additional food that we're going to have to grow. And the question is essentially, are we going to grow it on our existing agricultural footprint? or are we going to keep sprawling? And since it's really important that we not keep tearing down forests and wetlands, that means we need to do it with less land. That means we're going to have to make more food per acre, higher yields, so that we don't need more acres to make the same amount of food. And that's something that, when we're talking about people booing me, people don't like the kinds of agriculture that tends to make a lot of food per acre. They like kind of twee, more natural, kinder and gentler agriculture that they read about in Michael Pollan's books. They think that is good, leave nature alone agriculture. But in fact, if it makes less food per acre, it needs more acres to make the same amount of food. And it's the opposite of natural. It's tearing down nature. And people don't really like to hear that.
Are you optimistic about some of the technological advancements that we've had, whether it's, I see these like greenhouses that people are putting on their roofs in cities, or the lab grown meat and all these other things. Like, are you optimistic about technology pushing us in the direction that we need to go?
I really am. I should say I write about, dozens of, some of them really promising solutions in the book, and none of them have any traction yet. Which makes me sound like quite the Debbie Downer. The problem, our energy problem, we kind of know what to do, right? You want to electrify the global economy and run it on clean electricity. And we're actually starting to do it, right? We're in the middle of this extraordinary clean energy revolution where 90% of the power plants on Earth last year were zero emissions. Food is not like that. I wrote the book because I felt like not only didn't we know the answers, we didn't even know the questions, and the problem's still getting worse every day. But yeah, I mean, look, as a species, we kind of suck at making sacrifices for the good of the planet, but we're really good at inventing stuff. And even though plant-based meat and, as he said, lab-grown meat or cultivated meat made from animal cells, like plant-based meat hasn't really done well in the market. The dogs didn't really like the food. Lab-grown meat hasn't even really made it to market. It's just starting now, and it's still too expensive. But the cow is a pretty mature technology, and this stuff isn't. So I really am, whether it's alternative fertilizers or alternative pesticides or better ways of grazing. I went to the University of Illinois, where they are literally reinventing photosynthesis, right? A technology that's been working pretty well for 3 billion years, but turns out to be really inefficient at making food. And these guys are using artificial intelligence and gene editing and big data to essentially engineer away some of those inefficiencies. And they think they can increase crop yields 50% in 20 years. So I do think, rather than sort of waving our fingers at people and telling them to stop eating meat, or stop wasting food, which would help. I do think a lot of the technological advances are sort of our best hope for at least getting this problem somewhat under control.
You talk a lot about like some of these technologies in your book, and I did really want to ask you about them because they sound very intriguing. So Fitbit for pigs, Tinder for cows, invisible food peels for preservation, and my favorite is mRNA engineered something to prevent beetle constipation.
No, yeah, exactly. No, this is a perfect example, right? You think about like potato beetles are this. I talked to a scientist who described them as like a cross between Cookie Monster and like an M1 tank, because they eat everything. They eat entire fields worth of potatoes, and they are like really hard to kill. And so potato farmers bomb their fields with all these like nasty chemicals. And this company in Boston came up with basically using the same RNA technologies behind the COVID vaccines. They came up with essentially, instead of sending messages to us or to our genes to like resist COVID, it sends a message to potato beetles' bowels not to move. So they basically they die in their own toxins. I called it, they constipate them to death. It's like being able to send in Jason Bourne to kill the bad guys rather than nuking the entire city, right? You're just like a tablespoon full of this stuff is enough to just completely wipe out all the potato beetles in an entire field. And so it's very exciting.
I'm just envisioning Jason Bourne like going into a secret mission, but then like making everybody constipated. So this
Yeah,
is,
exactly. But you don't want to take out the ladybugs and all the kind of like beneficial organisms in the soil. You just want to kill the beetles, and this does that, and it does it without bombing the fields with all this nasty crap that's toxic and kills everything in sight.
okay, then tell us about Tinder for cows. Like, are cows struggling?
Well, it's sort of like, modern genetics, right? You're sort of hooking them up with the right people. All of these, the same with like the Fitbit for pigs is like, it's sort of monitoring them and using these modern technologies to make sure they're not sick, because when pigs die before they get turned into pork, that's a waste of all the resources and all the feed that went into, keeping that pig alive. Essentially, this is really a story about efficiency. And obviously, technology is really good at making things more efficient. In the agriculture space and the food space, efficiency has it's sort of a dirty word, right? You think of like rapacious corporations kind of dredging dollars out of the dirt, and technology has become a dirty word because, right, you don't want to eat technology, right? It's like, oh, Bill Gates is trying to implant something inside your brain. But this really is the way to, again, make more food, less mess, less land, and that is going to require these kind of technologies. When you think about, particularly on the meat side, animal agriculture is extraordinarily inefficient. It takes 9 calories worth of plants to feed to a chicken to get 1 calorie worth of meat, because you got to support the beaks and the feathers and the clucking and the breathing and the pooping and all kinds of stuff that doesn't make meat. And they're 10 times more efficient than cows, which are just spectacularly inefficient converters of their feed into our food. So you think about how these technologies can either, they can make the animals more efficient, you can make the feed more efficient, but you can also come up with ways to replace animals in our food chain. We eat like 60 billion of them a year, and it takes, 12 billion acres of land to raise them. So, better would be better.
Do you think that this is a story mostly about technology or about policy? I think so much about housing world is that we kind of actually know how to build an apartment building. It's just illegal to do so. When you're thinking about increasing density of agricultural yields, you've talked a lot about these cool technologies. Is that the main way out, or do you think that there's policy limitations keeping us from getting there too?
I think it really is going to have to be both. I mean, just for one thing, right? I mean, as I said in the beginning, our agricultural sprawl problem is 40 times bigger than our urban sprawl problem. Even with Ozempic, which might, maybe reduce our demand a little bit, you can't really get around the fact that we have 8.2 billion people on Earth now. We're going to have more, and they're all going to need a couple thousand calories a day, right? So we're going to have to make them. And there's only so much you can do through policy. You can kind of help us make it in a better way, but and you can maybe get rid of some of the externalities, the way that maybe meat is priced too cheaply. The current carbon markets basically incentivize, because they ignore land, which is the main theme of the book, that we've ignored land for too long. All of the incentives essentially are, there's no incentive to be careful with our land use. Those are all ways that policy can help. But really, technology is going to be very important too, because ultimately we are going to have to manufacture all those calories. We can do it the low yield way, the Michael Pollan way, which is is going to require cutting down a lot more trees and draining a lot more wetlands in order to make that food. Or we can try to do it with robots and with with AI and with gene editing and all kinds of things that a lot of Luddites get their knickers in a twist about this stuff, and they feel like I don't want to eat that. But GMOs are a perfect example of something that there's just no evidence that it's unhealthy or bad for the environment, but people hate it, and that kind of cultural opposition is going to be a challenge, and not only for technology but for policy as well.
Michael, if you had to make a tier list, so maybe your first top 1 or 2 innovations that you think are going to have the biggest bang for the buck, on, I guess, how much agriculture sprawl there is, what would you say would be your top rankings? And then also, why do you think plant-based meat hasn't caught on?
Sure. Well, I do think that alternative proteins, whether it's plant-based or cultivated meat, I would say that's the most important technology, because they use basically 90% less land and create 90% fewer emissions than meat-based meat. So I think it's really important. If I had to say number two, again, because beef and cattle generally are such a problem, even though it's a little bit less high tech, I would say sort of pasture intensification, because this really is, since beef is the problem, it's sort of like Willie Sutton said, he robbed banks because that's where the money was. I think if you care about reducing emissions from agriculture, you got to care about beef, because that's where the emissions are. And so on the demand side, it means coming up with substitutes that taste like beef and are just as cheap as beef, but aren't beef. And then on the supply side, it's I saw like these degraded ranches in Brazil that they'd have like one cow for every 5 acres, and the cow looked like it was on a hunger strike. And then I'd see these upgraded ranches where they'd spend not that much money, maybe like, $500 an acre on improving the grasses, and they'd maybe invest in a feedlot, but also they'd be fertilizing the pastures, and they'd be able to support one cow on every acre. So that meant they were 5 times as productive. They used 1/5 as much of the Amazon. And so I think you can really save hundreds of millions, if not billions of acres through better, grazing management and better pastures. So unfortunately, as you suggested, so far, plant-based meat has been somewhat of a bust, right? I started reporting this book in 2019 at the Good Food Institute conference in San Francisco, in Armand's hometown. And at the time, this was like just a couple months after Beyond Meat went public. And it was suddenly worth 1/3 as much as Tyson Foods. And people were just out of their frickin' minds. They were like having serious conversations about whether it was going to take 10 years or 15 years to get rid of the entire $2 trillion meat industry. My joke was that I thought I was going to accidentally raise a Series A round on the drinks line. But I went back to the GFI conference in San Francisco in 2023. And by then it was all doom and gloom. And it was just like, what were we thinking? This was all a fad. Nobody's eating this stuff. Beyond Meat had gone from $250 a share down to $2. The investment had completely dried up. And so I think, essentially, it was this incredible technological achievement to make meat out of plants that tasted 80% as good as the real thing and only cost 50% more. It was way better than the old, kind of vegan hockey pucks, but it wasn't as good as meat. So people tried it and then they didn't come back. But again, they can still make it better and cheaper and even healthier. And I'm confident that over time they will, but it's obviously not there yet.
I'm thinking that the price, so for me, it's like I was really excited about the Impossible Burger. And then, the price, I was like, okay, well, now that I've had it a bunch of times, it's a little pricey. And then also the ingredients list. I was like, what is in this? And the ingredients list was so long. And so it actually made me feel uncomfortable about eating it, because I was like, I don't know what I'm actually putting into my body here. Whereas if it were lab grown meat, maybe I'd feel a little bit better about that. I prefer one ingredient rather than 50.
Yeah, people say that, but it's yes, the plant-based meat is processed food, but what goes on inside a cow's stomach, that's a process, and it's made of chemicals too. They're just allowed to, say that it's one ingredient, beef. But that beef is made of plants, right? The plants that the cows eat. They use a rumen instead of an extruder to turn it into muscle. So again, I think it was too expensive. There's no question about that, and it generally didn't taste as good. But now you're seeing in blind taste tests, plant-based nuggets are already beating chicken-based nuggets. Who even knows what's in a chicken nugget, right? And it's mostly just a vehicle for sauce. But they're already as good. So there's really no reason to eat a chicken nugget anymore. And I think, the like Impossible Burger is getting close. It's still going to be really hard to replace pork chops and steaks and those sort of, the more complicated whole cuts. And like you said, I think that's where cultivated meat might have more value added. I've had a chicken fillet that's made from chicken cells, and it tastes exactly like chicken because it's chicken.
That actually, I think, touches on something interesting, which is I feel like there's sort of two issues that drive a lot of this, like after reading your book, is like, one, there's enormous sort of just financial interest in preserving the status quo. Like if you've got biofuels, if you've got biomass, like one thing that happens over and over is that people will try to put together like the right solution, and then like the industry will hire the right scientists and push on studies and like force in these insane assumptions. Then there's also just sort of the naturalistic fallacy, this idea that what feels natural is better. So like GMOs have existed for a long time. The real obstacle to their adoption is just skepticism. You've had, Florida, even though we don't really have lab-based meat at scale, they already banned it. And the biggest thing, which I want to talk more later about, but it's like people really, really think that like, I love the farmer's market. It's fun to go to, but like I understand that when I go to a cute little stand and it produces on a little farm nearby me, is way worse for the environment than if I bought it from like a giant processing, big ag. But like that feels really unintuitive to people. And so do you think the bigger political obstacle is sort of people's naturalistic intuitions, or is it like industry and money?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, the power of the agricultural industry generally is certainly an obstacle to policy change, I think. And then I think that people's natural intuitions about what constitutes good food and good farming, that is a massive obstacle to kind of cultural change. They're both really big problems. But, you're right. I mean, I think there is this, Michael Pollan has, he's a lovely writer, and he's definitely made a lot of people believe that the environmental sin of agriculture was the transformation of all these lovely kind of pastoral, rustic, old style farms that didn't make too much food, but had a kind of diverse amount of crops, and the animals had names instead of numbers, and, the soil was treated with love, that was kind of good farming, that was good for the planet. And then it was intensified, and we started like bombing it with chemicals and turning it into these monocultures, and they had these terrible factory farms where the animals were treated badly and the people were treated badly, and they used too many antibiotics. And like I just wrote a piece in the New York Times about how they dumped too much of their poop into the river. And that's all true. There was some environmental cost to this intensification. But the main point of at least the supply side of my book is that the real environmental sin of agriculture is extensification. It's agriculture expanding, not agriculture intensifying. And that like the real tragedy was not the intensification of those nice Michael Pollan farms. It was the transformation of nature into those Michael Pollan farms. That's when you lost the carbon. That's when you lost the biodiversity. And so now today, agriculture is absolutely our leading driver of deforestation, of water pollution, of water shortages. It uses 70% of our fresh water. And yeah, it's a third of our carbon emissions. So it's a really big problem. But, obviously I'm literally talking my book, but the problem is that we are eating the earth. And the problem is not that those farms that are eating the earth are getting more intense and making even more food. We need them to make even more food so that they don't eat even more of the earth.
I think in some ways, actually, these two sort of pressures of like the cultural bias towards like naturalism and pastoralism, and then the economic power of big ag kind of feed each other. Because if you look at like Europe, for example, or in the United States, like agriculture employs a very small percentage of the workforce. It's a big business, but it's actually not that much bigger than a lot of other industries that have a lot less power. Like we don't do multi-billion-dollar Twitter subsidies every year.
Right.
And that's like a large business. And so I think in some ways, what I see a lot of is that there's the halo of like, it's farmers and they're good and wholesome, and then they also have a lot of money, and like that feeds each other in a really powerful way. Like the thing I think about most is just in Europe is like every single time they try to like remove a tiny agricultural subsidy or like make farmers slightly less damaging to the environment, a bunch of tractors show up and they literally throw manure at offices, and then a bunch of people who consider themselves left wing will like tweet like, look at these farmers, it's so righteous and they're fighting. I'm like, you're like cheering on millionaires throwing feces at City Hall because they want to pollute more.
And we see the same phenomenon in the United States. And in fact, I talked to Tom Vilsack, who is Obama and Biden's agriculture secretary, and some of the people who worked for him, and they were pretty explicit that their goal was to avoid like tractors driving up to Capitol Hill. Even though farmers have become this extraordinarily loyal Republican voting bloc, Democrats are still just as, they pander just as hard with our hardworking farmers from the heartland, and they want to throw money into biofuel subsidies and, crop insurance subsidies and, counter-cyclical subsidies and disaster aid packages and conservation subsidies and basically all kinds of different ways to take money from ordinary taxpayers and give them to the 1% of Americans who farm. And the richer the farmer is, or the bigger the farmer is, the more money they get through this subsidy system. It's a very odd situation, but we are not alone. And you're absolutely right to see that connection with this, this kind of romanticization of like, these are somehow down, salt of the earth people. And now you're seeing on the, when you talk about this regenerative agriculture and the kind of like Michael Pollan style farming, you're seeing it being adopted by the big food companies, General Mills, PepsiCo, Mars, they are all, Danone, they're embracing this. And so are the big ag companies, Cargill, Syngenta, Archer Daniels Midland, these companies that we think of as like, the big guys and, with their giant conglomerates, they've embraced this, this sort of kinder and gentler farming, not because it's better for the earth, but it's because it's just another way to shovel money their way. I do think it is, we talked in the beginning about, all the people who boo me, even though I'm right. And I think, it is very hard going up against the agricultural Borg, because, around the world, there are $300 billion worth of agricultural subsidies every year. And most of it are just direct handouts with no strings attached. And so I come along and at the very least, I'm saying like, hey, can we at least attach some strings? So, we're not even going to say don't make so much food. We're just going to say, try to make less mess. But there is a really, well-oiled political machine that's been set up to avoid that.
What would you say to the end consumer? So like someone like me who like really prefers free range organic eggs, and free range takes up a lot more space than maybe keeping a chicken in a tiny coop. So like as I'm with my own dollars, I'm supporting something that takes up a lot more space. Is the solution to get the consumer to realize what the like end result is, or is it just to come up with like products that are still like as tasty and as good? Because I think the eggs actually, or the egg yolks, taste different than like I guess conventional mass manufactured eggs. So like I guess how do you balance that?
Well, the first thing I always say is like people should eat what they want and people should live how they want. Just in the same way that you guys aren't telling people to live in apartment buildings or live in single family homes, but that both should be available. I sort of feel the same way about food. And really, look, again, like I've cut out beef and lamb because those are by far the worst for the planet. But I still eat chicken, even though it's way worse than beans or lentils. And so I feel like, everybody finds the level of hypocrisy that you're comfortable with, right? Like I have solar panels and an electric vehicle, but I fly way too much. So perfect isn't usually on the menu. better is better than worse. And what I do say is that if you do want to try to be better for the planet with your diet, like I can give you a list of 50 ways to be a little bit better, but the two big ones are eat less beef and waste less food. Beef because it is by far the most land intensive food and the most emissions intensive food. And, we waste a quarter of our food, which means we waste a quarter of the land we use to grow the food. We use like a landmass the size of China to grow garbage. The average American household wastes more than $2,000 a year on food they throw out. So look, that's an area where people can make a difference. But, to me, not looking for non-GMO food, I think that's silly. Looking for, regeneratively grown. Yeah, I don't think there's any real health or environmental advantage. And in fact, as you suggested, regeneratively grown, organic, grass-fed beef is even worse than, ordinary conventional factory farmed beef, because it takes longer to get the cows to slaughter weight, so they burp and fart more methane, and they end up using a lot more land. Everybody can make their choices, and I'm not here to tell people how to make them. I do think ultimately you'd like to see, the kind of externalities priced in the same way we would like to with housing or energy. What I do talk about in the book is that ideally there would be a different kind of land ethic where we recognize that every acre is sacred. Land is not infinite. There's only so much on the planet, and that we want to use it all to, if it's housing, we want it to house as many people as well as possible. And if it's making food, we want it to make as much as food, as efficiently as possible. And if it's for the environment, we want it to be like the best kind of environmental areas and store as much carbon as possible and have as much biodiversity as possible. And I think it's just a different way of thinking about the planet that has not been part of our kind of like woo-woo thinking, but also has not been part of our actual numbers climate analysis. It just has not been priced in, and it hasn't been part of our incentives. So that's what I'm banging my spoon in my high chair about, trying to change the way we think about this stuff.
And I think the key thing there is pricing the externalities. I think that's for whether it's land use or whatever it is, it's like if we price the externalities and people pay the true cost of what it actually costs, that then leads to a better incentive structure, which is not what we have now. I think that's the key takeaway that I've been getting.
Well, I will say, since I'm always doing all this Debbie Downer stuff, that Denmark just passed, I like to call it the Michael Grunwald Agricultural Reform Act of 2025, because it basically did all the things I'm talking about. And by the way, Denmark has an extremely influential agricultural industry. They use a larger percentage of their land for agriculture than any other country except for Bangladesh. But this was done, the final deal was, environmentalists supported it, ag supported it. They have a 3-party system. All 3 parties supported it. So originally the environmentalists were like, look, we have so many pigs, we have so many cows, we have so much poop. We want to basically cut the herd in half. And as I've been discussing, Denmark is very efficient. They have an extremely efficient pork and dairy industry. And if you did that, you'd just be outsourcing their emissions and their deforestation to the developing world. So what they did instead is they taxed agricultural emissions, right? Like you said about, trying to price in the externalities. Instead of telling them, hey, don't make so much meat, they're going to help them make even more meat. They're going to invest in these kind of technologies we're talking about, whether it's feed additives to help the cows burp less methane, or gene edited crops so that they can grow more animal feed, even in drought tolerant feed or higher yielding animal feed. But at the same time, they're going to take some of their land, their marginal farmland, and return it to nature. And they're going to push throughout the country. They're going to invest in alternative proteins. They're going to push plant-based eating. So they're going to try to do all the things on the demand side and the supply side And again, I know it's like Denmark, right? That's like the, it's like they're the happiest country, they're the healthiest country, they're the model nation. It would be hard to get that kind of thing passed in the United States, but it shows it's not hopeless. Maybe they can be a model nation.
So let's talk about ethanol. For our audience, like, what is ethanol? What is the history of laws around ethanol? What were some of the weird assumptions that people made to think that ethanol is better for the environment? And ultimately, what do you think should happen?
Sure. I mean, so ethanol, which is corn ethanol, which is essentially it's an automotive fuel that's brewed from the corn that farmers grow in their fields. And there's a soy biodiesel that's made out of soybeans. There are a bunch of these biofuels, but they're essentially farm-grown fuels. And back, about 20 years ago, there was the United States passed a renewable fuel standard, which essentially was a biofuels mandate that over time has made about 10% of our gasoline is blended in with ethanol. And the idea at the time was partly it was during the Iraq War, and so we didn't want to be so dependent on Middle East oil. But there was also a lot of environmental talk, and that was even a little bit of climate talk. There were some studies showing that corn ethanol was a little bit better for the climate than gasoline. And the argument was actually it was incredibly inefficient to make it. Because it's like drilling and refining gasoline is actually pretty efficient, while this, like, you have to grow the corn, and then you have to take out the diesel tractors, and you use all the fertilizer, and then you have to harvest it, and then you put it in the plant to turn it into ethanol. You end up using almost as much fossil fuel as you replace, but not quite as much. And at this time, it was like the only alternative to fossil fuels. And then there was also this idea like, hey, you have corn and you're growing it in the field, that does remove some of that carbon from the atmosphere, some of the carbon that then you burn in the engine and it comes out the tailpipe, but then you grow the corn, and the idea was, well, all right, that'll soak it back up. So what everybody forgot is that when you had a cornfield that was growing food, you were already soaking up all that carbon. And if you grow fuel instead of food, you're going to need some more land somewhere else to grow more food. And that's not going to be a parking lot. It's going to be a forest or a wetland, something that stores a lot of carbon. And they had just completely ignored the land use disaster of using good farmland to grow fuel. And so they originally thought that biofuels were maybe like 20% better for the climate than gasoline. It turns out it's about 2 to 3 times as bad. It's just a complete disaster. And of course, the reason for it is it creates demand for these grains. So it increases the price of grain. So it makes food more expensive, and it makes hunger more prevalent in the developing world. So it's really just this horrible, it's like the worst possible way to shovel money to farmers. Sort of long story short is the hero of my story kind of figured out that ethanol and other biofuels were eating the earth. And, through his work and, other people who picked up on it, he helped turn around some of the scientists and a lot of the environmentalists who are pushing it. And it hasn't sort of expanded in the way people have expected. At the time, his original calculations was that we could lose a couple Brazils worth of land to grow biofuels. So far, we've only lost about a Texas worth of land. But that's really stupid. We shouldn't use a Texas worth of land to grow fuel. At the time, there were no other alternatives to fossil fuels. But now we have electric vehicles, and it turns out that it takes about 1 acre of solar panels. Produces about as much energy as 100 acres of corn grown for ethanol. It's just a horribly inefficient way to run our transportation system. And I'd like to say that we don't do it anymore, but no, we still do it. And there's a big push to do more of it.
So one thing about Syringer, who's like the hero of your story, I really liked, was that he's a person who's driven purely by being offended by irrational policy. And that like really resonated with me, because I feel like sort of my entire life is like half of what I motivates me to do this podcast and all this stuff is like I want to make the world a better place. But part of it's just like this monomaniacal like irritation when there's just insane irrational policy. And I was like, I need to meet him someday because he sounds exactly like me. But let's talk about the Kyoto Protocol, which is I think one of those. This is shifting from ethanol to biomass. So one, I think, explain to folks like what biomass is. And then two, if you could tell us about sort of the honest mistake in the Kyoto protocols that end up having, massive repercussions for the environment.
Yeah. So biomass power is essentially, burning wood for electricity. And it comes down to burning trees. And and the sort of the punchline is it turns out this like biomass is actually pretty good for the climate if you're using actual waste that would have ended up in the atmosphere anyway. If you might as well burn it and turn it into electricity instead of just burning it, that's fine. And it's the same with biofuels. If you're using actual waste, then biofuels can pencil out. It's only when you end up having to use more land to grow, whether it's more trees or grow more fuel, then it turns out to be an environmental disaster. Now, Kyoto, essentially, and this is going to wildly oversimplify, but they recognized that they had to do some accounting for greenhouse gases, and they had a sort of the land use account, which is how many trees are ending up, the carbon from forests that's ending up in the sky, and they had the energy account, which is mostly power plants when you burn something, and that the carbon ends up in the sky. And they had these two separate accounts, and they realized like, well, if you're burning wood, that's kind of mixing up the two accounts, and you don't want to count it in the forest when you cut down the tree, and then again when you burn it in the power plant. So what they basically decided is like, we're only going to count it in the forest. And, so if you're burning wood, we're just not going to count that. We're going to count that as carbon neutral. And that was all fine until Kyoto passed. And then suddenly, you had these laws where there were real repercussions for, not meeting these emissions. And also not everybody was in it. So like some countries that weren't part of Kyoto, like you could have this, you could be taking the carbon out of their forests. And so it wasn't counted because they weren't part of Kyoto. And then you'd burn it in the power plant. And it wasn't counted because it was allegedly carbon neutral. You weren't counting anything. And so this whole system that was set up to avoid double counting ended up basically zero counting. And of course, you had this incredible incentive if you had power plants in your country to burn as much wood as possible. Because it wasn't being counted. And really, they weren't even the countries that were in Kyoto, they weren't doing a very good job of counting how much they were taking out of their forests. So it basically had this huge accounting mess. And really, one of the lessons for this, I think, for all kinds of not just abundance policy, but policy in general, is that, as the main character in my book says, if you want to screw things up a little, do a bad thing. But if you want to screw things up a lot, put in accounting rules that incentivize everybody to do that bad thing. And that's what's happened with biomass power. That's what happened with biofuels. That's what still happens today with this idea where if you look at the carbon markets, since they don't take land into account, those degraded ranches I talked about, if you've spent money to upgrade your ranch and now you're using 1/5 as much land to produce the same amount of food, you're penalized by the carbon markets because the accounting's all wrong, right? You're probably, you have a feedlot and that's using some electricity, and you have more cows, so they're burping more methane, and you're fertilizing your pastures, so you have more nitrous oxide emissions, but you're not getting credit for all those acres of Amazon you're saving by being more efficient with your pastures. So again, I just think like, I tell people like, nobody would buy my book if I said it was a book about accounting, but it's not about accounting.
So one thing in your book, Michael, was this recurring theme I noticed of like really brilliant scientists who seem to make like insane assumptions that a normal person would say immediately is like, why is that? It doesn't make sense. And they never think about opportunity cost, and they don't really think through the incentives of what they're doing. I don't know just why. It's like these people are really smart and produce like amazing scientific papers, but then really simple assumptions about the world. They don't think through, they don't think through the incentives. Why does that keep happening?
I think some of it is like a certain inertia where things have been done one way and it doesn't occur to people to do it another way. And then there is a certain kind of wish casting where if you're a biofuel scientist, boy, it sure would be great if biofuels were really good for the climate. That would make your job much more important and cooler. And yeah, there is the kind of Upton Sinclair thing about how it's really hard to, get somebody to understand something that their job depends on not understanding. So there are a lot of, kind of even in the scientific world, there seem to be a lot of bad incentives, and I do tell these stories about some really well-meaning scientists and some honestly not necessarily so well-meaning, who kind of get caught up in their the way they've done things. They've got their professional reputation on the line, and when somebody comes along with a new idea and says like, "Hey, you're ignoring land use," it's first like, "Well, then land doesn't matter," and then it's like, "Well, how can we come up with all of these different bizarre and insane non-planetary assumptions to make land use matter as little as possible?" And so you come up with these equations that essentially say that if you took the 40 million acres of cornfields that the United States uses to grow ethanol and you suddenly turn them back to growing food, that would have absolutely no effect on, on the world's land use. Or vice versa. Or if you took the rest of the U.S. corn crop and turned it all to ethanol, that wouldn't tear down any forests either, or very few. And it's just, it is, as you say, like you can step back and use some common sense, as the main character of my book does. He was not a trained scientist. He was a lawyer. And he just said, this doesn't make any sense. And I think a lot of these, I've kind of made my career out of writing about sort of things that seem egregious to me that are hidden in plain sight. I'm not a very good investigative reporter. I think most of the kind of really terrible stuff is pretty obvious. And this is, like this whole book, right? You take a cross-country flight, you look out the window and you see all those rectangles and circles. You can see that there's a lot of agriculture out there. And my book is basically me waving my hands in the air and saying, there's a lot of agriculture out there. It's just like, but it's like all of Asia plus all of Europe. That's how much agriculture is out there. And nobody's doing anything about it. So I think once you hear that, I hope it's sort of hard to unhear. And, I think you can never really look out that airplane window quite the same way, I hope. But until you really think about it that way, if you're a biofuel scientist, you're not really thinking about the land use effect. You're thinking about, oh, wow, look how many fossil fuels we're replacing. And if you're a biomass scientist, you're thinking like, wow, we're replacing coal. It never occurs to you that by, tearing down forests, you're doing something that's even worse for the climate than burning coal.
If I could pass a magic wand, I would just make every American school required to take one day learning the concept of opportunity cost. Like that's just that. I feel like it would dramatically improve America.
It's exactly right. Maybe just read that Robert Frost poem, right? It's like the road not taken. It's like that road doesn't disappear when you don't take it.
Yeah, it's funny. I appreciated you earlier saying that this book isn't not about accounting. It's not necessarily about accounting, but it's not about accounting. And it's funny because that also really does relate to housing policy in many ways, because our tax structures are set up in a way that incentivize apartments over condo buildings. And there's all these things that I've been learning, being on city council, where it's like our incentive structures are just kind of messed up in a lot of ways. And so I'm curious from your perspective, in terms of, as you mentioned, that like there's almost no incentives to be careful about land use. What incentives would you like to start seeing? Is it just like the scientists needing to implement better assumptions and take into account land use? Or would you actually like to see a tax structure that changes how we do land use? What do you think would be sort of the best way forward there?
I do think it really, and I'm going to come out sounding like a real simpleton on this, but I do think like whether it's about, legislation or tax policy or the way carbon markets are structured, if you take the idea seriously that land matters, it changes everything. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that in most cases, land does not matter. So if you have one of those upgraded ranches that's doing a really nice job, like if you want to access the carbon markets, the smartest thing you can do is redegrade your ranch so it sucks again and you don't have as many cows on it. And it's just a change of mindset where, like you're starting to see in Denmark, where they are now, like they are creating agricultural policies that treat land as if it matters. And that leads to different sorts of tax structures. It leads to different kinds of subsidy structures. While in the United States, like our farm subsidies are just basically, the more land you have, the more money we give you. And we have this crop insurance where it's like, all of the incentives are to farm the most marginal land because there's no penalty. You don't get penalized if you lose your crop because you're going to get paid. So there are just all these incentives. And, to bring it back to some of the housing policy, right? You're starting to see in a lot of you're seeing in the Great Plains. I just saw in South Dakota, there's a big fight over this, in Iowa, where, you're seeing neighbors of agricultural operations are using their NIMBY power and saying like, we don't like the odors. We don't like, we don't want this in our, we don't want this in our backyard. And again, there probably are some things that shouldn't be in people's backyard, but there you need a kind of zoning structure where, you can't just use the kind of heckler's veto, just as you can't use it on you shouldn't be able to use it on more efficient land use for apartment buildings. You shouldn't be able to use it on more efficient land use for, high yield agriculture. And I just think, it's sort of not the way we're set up. We are a kind of heckler's veto kind of nation. That's a little bit in our DNA, but there are costs to that, and you do see. And I'm not saying it's necessarily an unadulterated good thing, but that's why you see in China, where they don't really give a shit about the heckler's veto, you're starting to see these 25-story pig factories. They're like pig skyscrapers, and that they're running like 1 million pigs through these skyscrapers in a year. And I'm sure it sucks for the pigs, but it does make a lot of food with not a lot of land.
Pig-oriented density.
Yeah, exactly.
So moving beyond the talk about agriculture, I was really curious. You ghost wrote firefighting. You profiled Ben Bernanke as the person of the year for Times. What's your hot takes on the new Fed chair recommendations on what's been going on in the Fed in general?
Oh, wow. Well, this is just me, not Bernanke or Paulson or Geithner or any of the others I worked with on firefighting talking. But I think Kevin Warsh is a hack. What I remember about the 2008 financial crisis is that throughout, even before, during, and after the crisis, he was seeing inflation behind every tree. He was just, this was the massive inflation hawk at the very worst time, probably since the Great Depression, to be an inflation hawk. Every one of his recommendations would have made things worse by essentially tightening policy at the time when we needed to loosen. And thank God he got overruled by the smarter people, Bernanke and Paulson and Geithner, who did not listen to him about that stuff. But now, of course, that when inflation is a pretty significant problem, he's going to be sent there by President Trump just to be an inflation dove for pure politics. He is, it's like, I don't have a lot of confidence in that guy's judgment.
Okay, before we go, we gotta ask our favorite question. Are there any books, blogs, podcasts, Twitter accounts, articles, anything that you can recommend that our listeners check out?
I'm going to put in a plug. Since we talked about alternative proteins, there's a character in my book named Bruce Friedrich, and he's one of my favorite characters. He used to be the head of campaigns for PETA. right? The people for the ethical treatment of animals. He was this vegan activist who used to go around like throwing blood at models who were wearing fur. He spent 15 years of his life just screaming at people that meat is murder and advocating for basically better behaviors. And he realized it wasn't working. We're eating more meat every year. We now eat 400 million tons of meat a year, and it's growing. And so he quit, and he became the founder and the leader of the Good Food Institute, basically the alternative protein, the sort of trade group, call it, but basically the sort of convening for all of these different fake meat companies. And he used to look like Jesus. He had like the long hair and the scraggly beard. Now he looks like George W. Bush. He's all clean cut. He dresses like a tech bro. He is a tech bro. And he has realized that basically you're not going to yell at people and shame people and even educate people into doing the right thing. You've got to just use technology to give them something that's just like meat, but without the antibiotic use and the animal slaughter and the deforestation. And so he has written a book called Meat, and it's coming out. It'll be just about when this podcast drops. And it's a nice read. He doesn't tell his personal story, but it's really kind of the case for alternative proteins. And what Bruce would say, and I wouldn't go quite as far as he would, but I quote him in the book saying basically that if we can't get alternative proteins to essentially over time crowd out a lot of meat, that we are colossal. It's not that it's the only technology that works, and but that if this one doesn't work and this one doesn't have that kind of mass adoption, that we're going to have real problems, even if a lot of the other technologies do. So I hope everybody will read Bruce's book, Meat. It's about abundant meat, but without the animal.
We will add meat to our long and growing reading list. All right.
Meat's back on the menu.
So meat, the book is back on our long list of book menu items. All right. On that note, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
I appreciate it, guys. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. We would love to hear your feedback and who you think we should have on next by tagging us on Twitter at Pie4Everybody or leaving a comment on YouTube. And we will be back in 2 weeks. See you next time. Pie gang.